That's excellent. Thanks so much, Sue. Thank you again to IIRSM for inviting me along, and to everybody that is on the call today. You have my sincere thanks for taking the time to come along today. I hope it's going to be interesting for you. This is going to be my last webinar of 2023, and I will begin it with a safety moment that I've told a couple of times this year. And the safety moment begins around and about a year ago. And the subject of our safety moment had developed a cough. And they immediately suspected that it was COVID. So they did a test and it came back that it wasn't COVID. And that was great. And the cough cleared up. There was a little bit of kind of cold symptoms with the cough, and that cleared up after about 2 weeks, but they were left with a raspy voice. And around and about 2 to 3 weeks later, their partner kind of gave them a friendly nudge and said, look, I know the cough's gone and I know the cold's gone, but the raspy voice is still with you. Why don't you give the doctor a call and see if there's still an issue hanging around? So the person called their doctor's surgery, and it was a telephone appointment that they had, and they explained to the doctor that they'd had a cold and a cough and that the raspy voice was left behind. And the doctor said, at this stage, don't worry about it. I'm perfectly satisfied that it's nothing that's going to lead to anything, terrible. So it'll clear up on its own. Give it 3 weeks. And if the raspy voice is still with you, then give me a call back. So the person put down the telephone with a big smile and thought, okay, no problem at all. 3 weeks later, unfortunately, the raspy voice was still there, but the person was feeling fit as a fiddle. But the doctor had asked, and the person had agreed that if it was still there in 3 weeks, they would give them a call back. So give them a call back they did. Again, the same doctor asked a raft of questions, a couple more questions than they asked last time, certainly, and at the end of the questioning, said to the person that, again, I don't think there's anything wrong here. We know the origin of when the raspy voice started. You're in a demographic that I'm perfectly happy with. You're a relatively healthy individual. It'll clear up on its own in another 3 weeks. If not, give me a call back. So again, the person reported back to their partner that the doctor was pretty satisfied and said it'd clear up in 3 weeks, and if not, to give them a call back. So lo and behold, 3 weeks later, the raspy voice was still there. So the person called the doctor and said, look, it hasn't gone yet. And the doctor said, okay, well, why don't you come into the surgery and I'll look over you. So a week later, the person found themselves in the waiting room of the surgery. And before they knew it, the doctor called them in to the doctor's examination room and started asking a list of what was very obviously routine questions. As the doctor progressed through his list of questions, he became visibly uncomfortable, moving in his seat, and his face grew concerned. At the end of that consultation, when the person was fully expecting to leave the doctor's surgery with nothing more than a routine prescription, the doctor sat him down and said that he was displaying the symptoms of a rather aggressive form of lung cancer. He said that there was another option that it could possibly be, but there were the alignment with those symptoms was less clear than it was with lung cancer. So this took the person by surprise, as you can imagine. So he was rooted to the seat in the doctor's surgery. He wanted some more information, so he asked the doctor how to get information on this and what the next steps were. And the doctor said, well, I'm going to book you in to get an immediate chest x-ray and also speak to a consultant. If you want any information in the interim period, then give me a call at the surgery or look at the NHS website. Nowhere else. Don't grab information from friends. Don't Google search. Just come to me or the NHS website, and we'll answer the questions that we can for you. So the doctor said, we've got a chest x-ray booked for you in about 3 weeks. and we've got a review with a consultant the week after that. So the person went back to his car, looked at his mobile phone, looked up the NHS website, and unfortunately found that only 1 in 5 people survive for more than a year after a diagnosis of this particular type of cancer that the doctor suspected. So that changed the person's world. He had to think about it, and he thought he couldn't burden his family and his loved ones and his friends with a diagnosis that hadn't actually been made yet because there hadn't been any intrusive testing. So before he told anyone, he was going to wait for the X-ray results, and he was going to wait to speak to the consultant. So in the next 3 weeks, what he did was he spoke to his solicitor. He got his will in order. He got his affairs in order. He made sure that he was possibly the most insured person walking the face of the planet, because he thought that if he was going to pass, he was going to leave those behind with the best possible life that they could have with him not around. So 3 weeks later, the chest X-ray arrived, and the person made his excuses at work, explained to his partner that he was going for a routine checkup, and went for his chest X-ray. And because of the absolute fantastic people that work within the UK's NHS, it was a distinctly underwhelming experience. He was in and out within 15 minutes. But then the consultation with the consultant arrived the week after. And the person arrived at a different part of the hospital and was sitting in the oncology waiting room and was looking around at people who clearly had got bad news. And the person started to worry. The person's name was called. He was led into the consultation room and sat down opposite a very gregarious and charismatic consultant who greeted him with a big smile and a handshake. But before the consultant was able to complete the handshake, the person took control and said, "Do I have cancer?" The consultant looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, you don't. I can't find any evidence of it on your x-rays." At that point, the nurse that was also in the room handed the person a tissue because she was expecting him to cry. The person's not a crier, so he handed the tissue back to the nurse, and he noticed that the nurse was dabbing her own tears. The reason the nurse was dabbing her own tears was because, as she said, she very, very rarely is in the room when there is good news given. Now, that rather downbeat, but very successful at the end, safety moment, the person in that safety moment was me. And I was, to say I was relieved to get a second chance at life was an understatement. And the reason that I share that safety moment, and the reason that I have shared that safety moment this year a couple of times, is it's a perfect demonstration of preparing for disruptive events. In my professional life, there's not an awful lot that can hit the organizations that I work with that we don't have contingencies in place. And when I sat down to the doctor the first time when he gave the suspected diagnosis of lung cancer, I was driving back home thinking, wow, if this was a company, this would have been planned for your personal life, and you've let it slip. So if you don't remember anything else from the webinar I'm about to give, I truly hope you remember this safety meeting, and remember that planning for disruptive events is a skill professionally, but it should also interweave throughout the entirety of your life. And with that, we'll move on to the first slide. So what does a global threat landscape actually look like and feel like? So there's a couple of things in this. It's what the global landscape actually looks like. So what the threat actually is, and the perceived threat. And these are two completely different things. So as you can see on the left-hand side, what we've identified as the most severe risks on a global scale over the next 10 years are failure on climate action, extreme weather, biodiversity loss, infectious diseases, and natural resource crisis. And as you can see from the picture on the bottom, what we're seeing on the news pretty much every single day really mirrors that. It's all about the financial crisis. It's about activism and demonstration, be that through geopolitical events or we're seeing a range of strikes within the UK just now, specifically transport strikes coming up over Christmas time. We're also seeing, as we move on to the right there, some of the environmental impacts, and of course the pandemic has not gone away yet. And because of the public's obvious interest within the pandemic, we're now seeing stories on a range of other viruses which, without COVID-19, there may not have been the public interest to have actually made the news reels. So what does this make us feel? Well, how we feel about the outlook for the world just now is 23% of people are actually worried, seriously worried about the world that they live in. 61.2% describe themselves as being concerned. So that's 2 out of 3 people are uncomfortable with the way that the outlook for the world looks, whereas there's only really 12.1% and 3.7% who, about 15, 16% you can say are positive or optimistic about the future. And what this tells us is that it tells us that we have a target demographic in general who need reassurance and who need comfort in order to operate optimally. So when we look at this in the granular sense and we think, well, what's the timeline and what's the potential global risk effects, we can start to derive our threat landscape in terms of a timeline, a Gantt chart, whatever you'd like to think about it within your organization and what's really the most important. So certainly in the next 0 to 2 years, extreme weather would appear to be the real risk on our threat landscape. And that comes down throughout the entire timeline as well. And what that actually feeds back into from the extreme weather action is everything from a natural resource crisis to involuntary migration to human environmental damage. And all of these things on the right-hand side, when you look at what they feed back into, so essentially the list in the middle, are all things that within your own organizational risk register, they will affect you in one way or another to some degree. So what are the real top 5 believed imminent global risks? Well, I prescribe to the biggest risk being geoeconomic confrontations. And I said that this will emerge as the critical threat to the world in the medium to long term. And certainly in the short term, you could talk about environmental crisis, but as we see the world accelerate into more of an unstable place in terms of geopolitical relationships, confrontations appear to be gaining ground as being the credible threat for us all. So whilst domestic challenges require immediate attention, and the pandemic and its economic consequences have proven that global risks do not respect political frontiers, it's really facing this crisis that's happening in the future, that's this rivalry that's happening in the future, that's the number one risk for me. So COVID-19 and what that has, what that's left us with is some really, really interesting secondary symptoms, so to speak, secondary outcomes. And that is the erosion of social cohesion. There's a livelihood crisis, and there is a critical mental health deterioration just now. Within the UK, the HSE have just published their yearly figures, and they said that out of the 1.8 million working days lost, 918,000 of them were down to stress, depression, and anxiety. Now, I know within the marketplace, there's some questioning about how the HSE have collected those figures, but regardless of that, it points us in a very certain direction. So debt crisis is also a huge thing. And this was identified to an imminent world for the threat for certainly the next 2 years. And they reckon that that's going to peak within the next 3 to 5 years. So that's when we're really fighting against things like inflation and stagnation as well. The planet, the extreme weather, climate action failure are among the top 5 short-term risks to the world. And the 5 more menacing long-term threats are all environmental related. And climate action failure, extreme weather, and biodiversity loss also rank as the three most potentially severe risks for the next decade. And obviously, when we talk about things like biodiversity loss, more so than extreme weather, that then feeds back into other areas of our threat landscape, such as COVID-19 and the emergence of viruses and health risks that we haven't seen before. And connectivity, digital inequality is seen as an imminent threat to the world as 3 billion people remain offline. And in terms of cybersecurity, that threat landscape is gaining pace every single day. But it's also the resilience of people to bounce back online once they've lost connectivity as well. This leaves a massive vulnerability for areas in the world that perhaps could be described as less developed. So I wanted to give 5 lessons from insights to practice, 5 lessons that you could really take away and have a think about and reflect on your own at another time. And these come from practices from military, law enforcement, security services, as well as major emergency management within high reliability, high risk industries and organizations, such as nuclear, oil and gas, aviation. The first lesson is the need for ground analysis in the delivery requirements. So it's very, very useful to start with a type of failure, damage, and attrition that could compromise your real core business goals. That makes you effective and it makes you efficient. And then working back from the undesirable outcomes makes for an open assessment of current practices and an appreciation of your capabilities, your levers, your tools, your processes that might need to be introduced, deployed, redesigned, or enhanced. And we're going to really concentrate on that in other parts of this webinar. And I'm going to give you a nuts and bolts idea of how that actually works in the real world. Be totally honest in the second one and appreciate the vulnerabilities within the broader ecosystem as well. So as well as examining the critical aspects and operations they control, the organization should look at the broader ecosystem in which they operate, the real context. So the shortfalls in terms of outages, delays to the third-party assets, your supply chain and how they can get hit. It's so often that we have single point failures that we haven't examined and had a chance to put either layers of resilience in or implement parallel systems, and they can really, really affect us further down the line. Number 3 is embrace the diversity of resilience strategies, which is rather appropriate considering I just mentioned systems that are in parallel and layers of resilience. So some crises can be mitigated by placing emphasis on just in case reliability rather than just in time efficiency. So there are certain things within crisis management and business continuity where we really need to not throw away, but really question the traditional legacy MBA teachings of how we run a business. So implementing backups and redundancies, processes, ensuring the organization can adapt are all time sensitive and are all resource heavy things to do. So what we need to do with that is balance that on the quantum of risk. So for example, if it's a very low likelihood that anything is going to happen, then you don't need lots of redundancy, you don't need lots of backups, and you don't need lockups placed all around your forward operating bases, which have got lots and lots of products that you like to sell. If the risk of disruption to that is low, then depending on your risk appetite and your risk tolerance, perhaps you don't need any of that at all. You just need to have a good think about contingencies in place. So it doesn't have to be hugely expensive. That is dependent upon the quantum of risk. Connected resilience efforts with other goals is critical. So ESG, many of them are fantastically aligned with resilience platforms and resilience goals. So for example, a shortening supply chain is going to be less adverse carbon to the environment, and it's also going to build in a shorter decision line, shorter supply chain, effectively less things that can go wrong. And also consider resilience to be a journey. It's never a destination. Your leading resilience programs learn from stress testing and crisis to emerge even stronger. It is your constant aspiration for perfection. And I would hope that everybody on this call, in one way or another, however you like to dress it up within your organization, is always practicing and is always aspiring to be as good as they can possibly be. Will you ever get there? I dearly hope you do, but I know I will never get there because I'll never be satisfied, and I'll always try to go that one step further and get that little bit better. And that should also be the way that you approach resilience. You'll never be in a place, hopefully, where you sit there and think it's all done. The best you can ever hope for is an uncomfortable feeling of vulnerability. And that's where you really need to be with resilience. So, how do we prepare for when a possibility becomes a reality? I wanted to make this webinar really pragmatic. So I want to tell you exactly what I do and the reasons behind that. And the reason I wanted to do that is so that you can look at what I do and think, you know what, Steve, that's a great idea, or that really doesn't work for me, but you've inspired me to think about something. So what I like to do is I like to begin with a pestle onto my risk register. So the pestle goes through political, economic, social, technological, and um, legal and environmental considerations. And you can see that it's everything there from tax policy down to regulation, down to IP protection and business law, how that actually affects your business. And then what I usually do is if I've got perhaps one, two, three, four, even five things out of that pestle that look like they could be really challenging or they have a large escalation potential, then I'll even go a step further and I'll run a SWOT on those individual aspects so that I can be super confident with my client that whatever decision that we make, and I'll get on to decision-making frameworks later on in the webinar, that the decision has been from an informed point of view. So in terms of that, what is business continuity management? What is that decision process? Well, business continuity management it's about identifying those parts of your organization that you can't afford to lose. So do you need BCM in every single part of your business? No, you certainly don't. I sit with people constantly throughout my career who literally make a mountain out of a molehill. And I have always been trained one way or the other to try and keep things as simple as possible and to make those simple things excellent rather than have a broad range of things which need to be massively resourced and perhaps the standard of your delivery isn't as great as it possibly could be. So when I talk about BCM, please don't think that I'm talking about every single process in your organization needs to have an aspect of business continuity management, because it doesn't. It's just those parts that you cannot afford to lose. What are the parts that you cannot afford to lose? Again, that's up to you and your organization. It's one of the most interesting things that I do when I sit down with clients is that I find out about the risk tolerance, I find the risk appetite, I find the risk requirement. And if I'm speaking to someone that is particularly prudent, then they might say, you know what, I can't afford to lose 80% of my business. If I'm speaking to someone that is a little bit more uh, happy to take risks, so to speak, then that 80% might even be down to 30%. And what we try and do is once we've identified what we can't afford to lose, BCM is just about planning how to maintain these if or when a disruptive event happens. So any incident, when natural, accidental, deliberate, whatever it is, can cause major disruption to your organization. And it's a passion of mine to really, those of you with a services background might call it war games or red teaming, where you really have a look at what you have in place and you pen test it, you penetration test it, you stress test it. And this means that rather waiting for it to happen in real terms, when it does happen, you're prepared and you're able to get back to business quicker than your competitors. What do delays mean? Delays mean you lose business. You lose reputation, you lose market, you lose customers, you lose confidence. But again, like I started on this slide, let's keep it really simple. So all we do is basically we need to consider the following questions. What are your real key products and services that you have to deliver in order to stay commercially viable? What are the critical activities and resources required to deliver them? So what are your products and services? And then go one step back. What do you need to do in order to provide them? And then you need to conduct a risk assessment on those critical activities. So what are the risks to those critical activities, which would then stop you providing your key products and services? And then how will you maintain the critical activities in the events of an incident? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to run you through something that I like to do, and I always I try and do most of my business on the Deming cycle, because I tend to find the Deming cycle is really easy to understand, and it's it's universal, and it can be an infographic, so I can be speaking to coalface or C-suite, and everybody gets it. So we're just going to look at plan in terms of this, and that's going to be the needs of the interested parties, which essentially, if you're able to satisfy the needs of the interested parties, it means that your business is viable. So what we need to do to begin is we need to conduct the business impact analysis, and that's going to feed us back into the business continuity management questions that I was talking about earlier. So a business impact assessment and analysis, and if you haven't done one before, you can trust me when I say it's actually great fun, or it really can be. It's really interesting, and you'll learn an awful lot about yourself, but it has to be done within a psychologically safe environment with a group that is bought into it. I would advise the group to be relatively small, 4 or 5 people in most organizations. Anything more than that, you have too much input. Anything less than that, you tend to find that 1 or 2 strong characters drive things, and you miss out critical context. So it identifies your products and services, the critical activities, the impact of disruption, and the resources required to resume activities. So what's the first step? Well, the first step is to list the key products and services your organization provides, which, if they're disrupted, will have the greatest impact. So you list them down and you put a timeline on them of what that's going to look like in the first 24 hours, what it's going to look like in 24 to 48 hours, what it's going to look like up to 1 week. So if those key products and services are disrupted, what will it make your business look like if you have product B, which is a bestseller in your market, and you lose that, and you lose it for a week? What does that look like? So once you've done that, you can now identify the length of time that you can manage a disruption to each of your key products and services without threatening your viability. So what I mean by that is maybe you can lose product B for 1 week and you're not seeing a tragic difference on your P&L sheet, but you really need product B back up and running, fit for purpose within 2 weeks to keep that revenue continuing dropping into your bank account. And that's when you set the point in time at which each of your key products and services would need to be resumed in the event of that disruption. So product B, when do I have to get it back online and producing again? So what do you do in step 4? So you now document the critical activities that are required to deliver that key products and services. And then you really quantify the resources required to maintain the critical activities at the acceptable level. So what kind of people do you need? What kind of premises do you need? What kind of technology? What kind of information? And what kind of supplies do you need? So in terms of a BIA and some of the common questions that I'll certainly ask when I'm sitting with a client will be, in terms of people, what's the optimum number of staff you require to carry out your critical activities? But after I ask what the optimal amount of staff to carry out your critical activities, I'll also ask what the minimum amount of staff is and what's maximum amount of staff as well. I'll also need to know what skills and level of expertise is required to undertake these activities to ensure that there is internal resilience in terms of if we lose access to a certain member of staff, do we have a single point of failure? Premises, and this has changed for an awful lot of us since the pandemic, but do we need a location, and where's our fallback location if we lose our primary? Do we have alternative premises to go to? And in those alternative premises, do we have the plant machinery and other facilities that we really need to carry out the critical activities? Probably if we're looking at risk profile of all these things, technology and information provides the highest risk profile. So what IT is essential to carry out our critical activities, and what systems and means of voice and data communication are required to carry out our critical activities. And really, where do we keep the processes, keep the infrastructure, keep the company management system that is going to direct us to continue to produce product B up to and beyond the minimal standard that we do ever present anything to the market. Suppliers and partners just behind technology and IT present the next biggest risk for me, and that is down your supply chain. And of course, there's many circumstances where you're only ever going to be as strong as your weakest link. So that's why the likes of your verification and assurance, not only your QA, but your QC should really be stretching down your supply chain to identify where that weak link is. And also bear in mind as well the old resilience axiom that you'll never ever not have a weak link. All you'll ever do is move your weak link. So you need your weak link to be acceptable. So running the BIA, and again, as I say, this is really great fun, and this is where it running the BIA risk assessment then ties into the last bit. So this is the clever bit. I think it's clever anyway, but then again, I'm easily impressed. In the context of the business continuity management, you then run a risk assessment, and that looks at the likelihood and impact of a variety of risks that could cause a business interruption. And by assessing these, you'll be able to really prioritize your risk reduction activities. So the first step to your BIA risk assessment is you conducting the risk or analyzing and considering the risk of a loss of staff, systems, utilities, premises, etc. And obviously you're doing this with a cross section of the company that you're working for, because you essentially are a resilience specialist and a resilience facilitator, but it is going to be the people in the room that have the right answers. Your job is to draw out those right answers. You don't have all the answers. And if you ever approach a business impact assessment thinking that you do have the right answers and all the right answers, and you don't need anyone else, then I would advise you to check yourself and remove yourself from the situation. So you facilitate that room, and you talk about and analyze the risk of loss of staff, systems, utilities, premises, and then you list the likelihood. You have a look at what you currently have in place to prevent or reduce the likelihood. And then you have a look at the arrangements that you would like in place to prevent and reduce the likelihood even further. And you assign a likelihood score to each of the risks. Now, once you have that likelihood score, you use the risk matrix plot, which you can see on the screen just now. The likelihood in step 5 against the impact as previously identified in the BIA. So you got your step 5 and you got your business impact assessment, and you combine the two to find out where you are on the quadrant on that matrix. And obviously something with high impact and high likelihood is going to be treated an awful lot different from something that's low impact and low likelihood. And it goes back to the theory behind the Eisenhower matrix of really identifying what is important and not necessarily what is urgent. Now, once we have that, we can then have an informed discussion, and this is the decision-making framework that I mentioned earlier on, about how we want to risk rank and whether we want to treat, tolerate, transfer, or terminate that risk. So do we want to treat it? Do we want to use business continuity management to reduce the disruption by ensuring that the activity continues and recovers? Do we want to tolerate it? So if you remember the 80%, 30% example that I gave earlier on, 30% being somebody who's much more risk tolerant. So they would be more likely to accept the risk and do nothing and say, you know what, I'll take that chance. Do we want to transfer the risk? Do we want to think about things like insurance or contract arrangements where we have certain reduced payment angles to our contracts? Or do we want to terminate? Do we want to sit there and say, you know what, the risk is just too great. I'm sitting on a very poor metaphor, but I'm sitting on the edge of a cliff here and I'm just not happy. So I'm just going to terminate everything. I'm going to go to the top of the hierarchy of controls. I'm just going to eliminate that risk completely. So that's the BIA. And it is a absolutely fascinating process to go through. You will learn an awful lot about yourself. You'll learn an awful lot about your client. And it is also critical as well to do a hot debrief at the end and really to ensure that you capture some of the interesting conversations that go on during that entire process, because you'll tend to find that they will then have an impact or an influence on other things within your risk register. So it really is, going back to that Deming cycle, it really does, it closes the entire loop, and it's fantastic continuous improvement. And it will take you on further steps towards operational excellence as well. So what does it look like when I do it? Because, you know, it's all very well talking about these interesting, you know, BIAs and PCM and blah, 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 but what does it actually look like in real terms? Well, at the very bottom of that page, I've taken a cut and paste of a business impact assessment template that I use. And I'll run through that with clients. I'll run through that with my own organization to make sure that we're as good as we can possibly be in terms of business impact assessment. There's also a number of flow charts and a number of different kind of elevating processes that I use. One you can see on the left-hand side there, where the reason that I've included this is because there's a timeline that you can see just down the right, 10 to 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 to 3 hours. Planning in that kind of aspect is absolutely critical. So I've put a timeline on most things, but it just shows the escalation potential. And key tasks as well, taking the real learnings from the likes of crew resource management, from our colleagues over in aviation, and also from the marine sector as well, the maritime sector. They do some amazing things, and just making sure that, you know, the human failure rate is so large when you have disruptive events that you've got a very basic tick box exercise just to make sure everything's been done. But with all that being said, what we should also remember is that, as Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they're punched in the face. So you may have, from your business impact assessment, you may have created some really nice checklists and some really nice escalation processes, but don't forget to write in agility as well. Don't forget to be able to arm your crisis response team or your emergency response team, whatever you like to call them, with the empowerment to be able to address a situation as they see fit at the time, as long as there are a very small amount of principles that they follow to ensure that their decisions aren't veering too far off the critical mission path. Principles being, for example, professional integrity for me is always the first one, but the PAIR principle. So wherever we are looking to deal with an emergency response, that we prioritize people, then the environment, then the asset, then the reputation. So that's the PAIR principle. So what are the real common pitfalls in business continuity management? Well, where do I see people really, you know, dropping the ball? The problem is that it's needed infrequently. So the likes of quality management, when you're talking about TQM principles and you're talking about just-in-time inventory control, that's things that you need day to day, and that's things that senior leaders can look at and say, okay, so I can examine the return on investment of that immediately. Whereas in terms of business continuity management, they perhaps can't do that. So we're talking about the very low frequency, very high impact results. And a business it'd be perfectly foreseeable for a business to go through its entire life cycle without ever really needing to bring in any BCM pitfalls. Well, that's something that could have been said before the pandemic, certainly. So it's tough to get buy-in. So on things like business continuity plan testing or drills, that is going to be viewed by some that don't completely understand the concept and that haven't been involved within the risk conversations as perhaps being completely non-productive time. Why do we need to test? Why do we need to drill for something that I don't believe is ever going to happen? Now you're going to have real engagement issues there, which means you're going to have quality issues. So really identifying and managing those stakeholders as the facilitation of BCM is critical. Also retaining the capabilities to support BCM because it's not a daily conversation. When we look down the technical skills of those that we have within an organization and perhaps we reach a disruptive event within the market that means that we need to unfortunately let people go, some of the non-technical skills that are involved within BCM are sometimes not considered. But these are people that we might be letting go who are really absolutely critical towards the BCM practices. And it's something that you really need to review the process and rationale for constantly for relevance, because in the same way as a business, day to day never stays the same. And so the management system has to breathe with the business in order to stay relevant. The BCM principles also need to breathe with the business in order to stay relevant. It is absolutely critical that you don't have too many, but it's critical that you don't have too few. It has to be the correct fit for the business. Otherwise, you create needless inefficiencies. And then we go back to that really difficult buy-in conversation with a senior leadership team. So your steps to success are pretty easy. And these are steps to success that I've found work for me. They might not work for you. But I always put people first, whether that's managing the stakeholders or whether that's selling why we're doing what we're doing, whether that's preventing redundancies or whether that's making people into a success. It's always the people first aspect that I tend to find works best. I will spend a large amount of time understanding the business and the way that it operates. And I'll do that because of my own personal and professional preferences, but I'll also do that so that they get the most out of the BCM process. Once you have a true understanding of the business, and that includes the culture of the business, that includes not just the formal hierarchy within the business, but the informal hierarchy as well. And some of the people that might help you the most within business continuity management is not necessarily the people with the big job titles, but it's the informal people who actually run your warehouses or your coalface. It's critical to manage your interested parties and your stakeholders. It's critical to identify them, first of all, and then manage them appropriately. So depending on what kind of business that you have, this could involve inviting down local law enforcement or emergency services who you would be amazed how open they are to come down to your business, especially if you break out the best hobnobs and have freshly ground coffee. They will they will enjoy coming down and involving them within your drills and really getting buy-in and getting that insight into at what stage they may step in. So if we're talking about you're preparing for disruptive events that could have wider societal impacts. If you're talking about, for example, a social uprising, riots, you have high footfall within your operation, then it would be really interesting to speak to local law enforcement and find out what they would do, when they would step in, and then you can accommodate your BCM practices to suit that. So BCM should also be integrated into your strategy at as many levels as possible. It's going to bring you resilience. It's going to bring you reputation. It's going to make your investors an awful lot happier and an awful lot feel an awful lot safer when they're in their beds at night. You should balance training and practice. The amount of times that I've turned up and I've been commissioned by a client to come in and they say, you know what, come in and really put my team through the ringer in terms of a disruptive event. I'll maybe fly out to an oil rig and I'll say, you know, there's been a helicopter crash out on deck. How are you going to do this and how are you going to do that? There is absolutely no point in doing that, be that land-based, be that in nuclear and oil and gas and wherever you are, unless you've assessed whether the team are actually in a position in order to practice. And they have to have a certain amount of competence in order to then practice. So you need to do a little bit of digging and find out, are you dealing with a competent team? Is everyone on the team competent? So you can then go straight into drills and things like that, and you can take them up to the next level or the required level. Or do you have a weak point in the team that essentially all you're going to do is you're going to run a drill, you're going to embarrass someone, you're going to point out the fact that a competent system in terms of their emergency response has failed. So you need to have a look at the team that you're dealing with and make sure you understand their capability and their capacity as well. And be informed and realistic. It's up to you to be the best that you can be. Excellence is a habit. To stay informed of the risks within the world, to stay informed of the latest methodology, the latest techniques, who the thinkers are in the market, who the products are in the market, what can keep you one step ahead of the game, but to also be realistic, to make sure that you understand the quantum of risk, to make sure that you're not going to get a massive amount of budget to deal with something that is a very, very low risk. So stay realistic. But most importantly, act, do stuff, talk about business continuity management. When anyone walks into your business, it's not an unhealthy thing to talk about. It's like HSE or HR or IT or business support. When you walk into your business and say, you know, what are the really interesting functions here? What do you talk about every now and again? Well, you know, we do this and we do this and we do this, and you know, maybe every quarter we have what they call a BCM drill, and it's really interesting. So last time, you know, there was a group of, I don't know, say the drill had 10 or 15 people in it, and it was a drill for cyber attack, and you know, there was a dropped thumb drive out in the car park, and one of the new people brought it in and put it into their laptop, and it said, you know, owner of thumb drive, click here for details. And they did that, and it downloaded a load of stuff, and then we had to turn all the laptops off, and it turns out we didn't have this and didn't have this and didn't have that. Just a bit of fun, but talk about it and actually do stuff. So what's left for you to do? It's very much, you know, I'm going to throw it out to you here. I make my living out of this, so it's up to you. But if I were you, what I'd do is I'd have a real good look at your risk register. Is it something that you're actively using just now? Is it something that you use to predict your threat landscape in the future? And overlay your business continuity management program principles on top of that, you know, which you can find on a Google search. There are some amazing things out there. And if you want more information, then contact me. It's not always a commercial relationship with me. I genuinely just want to be out there and adding value. So if you want to give me a call, if you want to drop me an email, if you want to do whatever you want to do, my LinkedIn profile's there, my email's there. It would be an absolute pleasure to talk to you and bounce ideas off. But what we can't do is bury our head in the sand. What we can't do is predict through subjective feel. There is so much data in the world just now and so many risk reports coming from solid source information that it is unrealistic to say that you don't know what the future holds, because the future is relatively easy to predict right now. and it's your job to have that in a risk register and be managing it appropriately. So I think we've got about 10 minutes left, and I think I've got about 10 minutes of battery left in my laptop as well. So I would welcome any questions.
Okay, first of all, somebody said that they've really enjoyed the presentation, and thank you for giving up your time this afternoon. So I've got a couple of questions for you. Who do you think should be ultimately responsible for creating the BIA? Is it a cross-section of the company working together to get a range of views from different people across the workforce, or is it one person having ultimate responsibility?
Well, ultimate responsibility sits with the CEO. In my eyes, how you actually put that together, I usually conduct almost a risk rating exercise with the senior leadership team at what I'd want within that senior leadership team, as well as employee representatives. And then from that conversation, we can start really identifying where our risks are. And if we even need to go into the likes of a BIA, I might walk into an organization and they turn around and just say, you know what, it's all good. But having said that, that's never actually happened to date. But yeah, it's the CEO that is responsible.
Okay, thank you. And how often, I think you touched on this slightly, but how often should we reassess our plans and our registers and our BIA to stay relevant?
Oh, that's a brilliant question, and it's not one that I'm going to be able to answer with any kind of binary timescale on it. So you revisit your risk register and you revisit your BIAs if there's been any material change to context or environment, but also depending on the risk that it is to your business. So if it's an exceptionally high risk, if I'm working with a client who has a big risk.
Hello, Stephen? Stephen, can you hear us? Oh dear, it looks like Stephen has had some technical issues with his laptop this afternoon. So I think we've got other questions that I will put to Stephen, and I'll ask him to answer them, and we can send out the answers to them. So the other questions we had was about communicating plans to teams effectively without actually overwhelming them. And then the other questions that we had from people with us this afternoon is about how, if there has been an incident, how we then incorporate learning back into that planning, and where the time, whether that was time sensitive, whether you do it immediately or whether you wait for a bit to actually reflect and come back. So I'll ask Stephen those questions offline. He's obviously got some technical issues, so I do apologise for this. And then the other question that we had was to do with, from his experience, are there any types of disruptions which organisations that he's dealt with have overlooked? And is that something that we can take on board and make sure that we don't overlook them? So I think because we've got the bit of technical issues, I'll get to Stephen to answer those questions offline, and I'll send them out, his responses out to you. So I think we'll leave it there for this afternoon. I do apologise for the technical issues at the end. The recording will be on the IIRSM Hub later, either today or tomorrow. So you'll be able to catch up and recap on anything else in your own time. So I think we'll end everything there. Have a good rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at a IIRSM webinar in the very near future. Okay, bye-bye.